We're good. How are you doing, Alexander?
I'm doing extremely well. Beautiful March weather here in London. I mean, it's absolutely golden. I understand in Athens it's not so good, but here in London it's a glorious, beautiful days. Very big contrast to the news, which, as I said, is getting harsher. And by that I don't just mean the war, but we had absolutely terrible economic news for Britain yesterday, as I mentioned in a recent program I've done for my own channel. But this year is going to be the steepest fall in living standards since records started in 1956. Mm-hmm. So I mean, and that gives you a feel for the sense of the thump that we're experiencing. And it was very, very interesting to see how the political class, which has been in a state of almost intoxication over the war. I mean, there is a strange, ugly euphoria that's taken hold ever since, as I said, that disastrous Munich Security Conference back in February. And Britain has been particularly bad. But yesterday, you suddenly felt that they've crashed down to earth.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to another live stream. Thank you, Valies, to open it up with that super chat. And thank you, FL64, for that super sticker. Welcome to all our reviewers on Odyssey, on Rumble, on YouTube, and our locals community, the Duran.locals.com. Good to have you all here with us. Let's say a quick hello to our moderators. Spartan Warrior Queen is with us. Valies is with us. And who else do I see here that is moderating? I think it's just you two for now. Brandon says, let's go. Welcome to the community, Brandon. Thank you for that super chat. Let's go. All right. Yeah. Okay. Valies and Spartan Warrior Queen. All right, Alexander. We are waiting for Robert Barnes. I sent him a link, and he'll be able to join us when he's ready.
When he's free.
But what news do we have to talk about?
Gosh. Well, I mean, we've got lots of news to talk about. I mean, as I said, I mean, I mentioned at the start of this program, the mood in Britain has suddenly shifted from a sort of delirium to one senses that they've suddenly come down to earth. Then we've had this NATO conference in Brussels. Of course, we have a whole set of meetings in Brussels over the next couple of days with Biden there. And they issued a declaration, which I thought actually in places, it sounded to me, I'm sure this wasn't the intention, almost plaintive, almost begging the Russians to cease fire, which was, quite a curious shift of tone. I mean,
no, go on.
Anyway, but
because I've got Robert right here. One sec. Yeah.
Well, let's move. Let's have him join us. Let's have the great there. And Robert, it's great to see you. There's the legend, the man himself. Splendid to hear from you, Robert. Just before we started this program, I was on the website of the Quincy Institute, which is called Responsible Statecraft, and there was a long piece there about the old right and about the historic tradition of the Republican Party and its anti-war tradition. And it reminded me so much of all the things you were telling us in our last live stream. And it mentioned something which I didn't, by the way, know, which is that the lone congressman, the lone member of the House of Representatives who voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was an old right Republican left over from the 20s and 30s who wasn't going to be pushed into endorsing a war which didn't make any kind of sense to him. There's a very, very good article, and by the way, it's a good website, Responsible Statecraft. Just wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, people are rediscovering it. People like J.D. Vance, Blake Masters, Eric Greitens, all Senate candidates here in the United States have all taken to different degrees, but have stood out in their primaries by opposing further intervention in Ukraine, any kind of escalation. Joe Kent, congressional candidate that gets a lot of public attention. His wife, I mean, he's an ex-CIA guy. His wife died in overseas operations in Syria, and I don't think he's forgot that.
Mm.
And he's been very noteworthy about it. I think it's the American intellectual elites, political class, have forgotten this long history. I mean, they used to celebrate John Quincy Adams' speech to Congress in 1821. Americans do not go abroad searching for monsters to destroy, lest we become the monster ourselves. And this was the robust American tradition that World War I was a deviation from, that the debacle of World War I led to all the war racketeering committees. The famous book by the famous military man, War is a Racket, is written in the 1920s.
Is this Smedley something or other?
Smedley Butler.
That's right.
My friends Eric Hunley and Mark Grobert on America's Untold Stories recently just did a whole breakdown of his whole career and tenure. He went into all the things he regretted, his involvement in all the different places in Central and Latin America we got involved in the early 20th century. But in particular, we always stayed out of, though, even during that time period, no European wars. That was, that was a core belief of the founding generation of Americans. And yet, we're back, but that may be because the people that are running things now aren't really serving America's interest, even though they're doing it in the name of America. They're doing it in the name of in the interest of a globalist agenda that's not really an American agenda, and they're just leveraging American power to try to achieve it and attain
it. Somebody actually said on a thread of it was actually one of my the live stream that I had on Wednesday for locals. I do a live stream, as you know, every Wednesday, and somebody said, what if all of these sanctions actually backfire against America and lead to, America forced to rebuild itself and rebuild its industries? And won't this be bad for Russia and the rest of the world? I said, I don't know whether it'll be bad for Russia or the rest of the world. At least I don't think I said, but it will be good for America. I mean, if we got that kind of outcome, if we returned to the kind of America that was, and which was very much the America that I was so influenced by. I remember when I was, when I was young, when I was a child, I was brought up on old films like, and TV programs like The Untouchables, for example, with the man who used to play the Treasury agent who fought Al Capone. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but that is the America that I still believe in and want to see. And I would point out that this is a Duran thing, and I've got the US flag there, because that for me is the real America. And I just don't know where this strange superstructure came from that suddenly appeared after the war and dominated American policy. And what I wanted to say, Robert, now I don't know whether you agree, I don't know whether you watched Zelensky's speech to Congress, but it was so obvious to me that he was talking to this elite America. He's bringing up all the sort of tropes that they want to hear, Pearl Harbor, MLK, all that kind of thing. And I'm not, saying anything against MLK, by the way, but it was their America he was talking to, not the America that I remember, which was the America that you've just mentioned. And I wonder what Americans, to the extent that they ever followed that speech, made of it. I saw that David Stockman hated it.
Yeah, I think the robust populist tradition in America never went away. It got momentarily diverted by World War II. That World War II was seen as successful. That World War II was really, that's the reason why in America, they always use the World War II script. Everything's always 1939, Hitler, and unless we intervene, and all that jazz. And so where, not the World War I script, and not all the wars since World War II. The Korean War script, they don't use that. Vietnam War script, can't really use that one. Can't use either the Iraq War scripts. Can't use the Afghanistan War script. Can't use the Libya War script. Can't really use the Sudan or Somalia or even Serbia a war script. It's always World War II. Freedom Tunes made a great little 2-minute clip of this, where this guy's recruiting this kid and everything's Hitler, and it's just one dumb war after the next dumb war while the defense industry money mounts. But I would say this has been this sort of warmongering has been in part a tradition of other governments. Kevin Phillips was making this point all the way back to the 1970s, that, there's a history of like the Dutch, like the British, that you get so powerful with your manufacturing base, you forget that's what gave you your power. And you're in the economic elite within that group find somewhere else to make their products cheaper to enrich themselves at the expense of their own country's sovereign interest. And then ultimately that country they empower replaces them. In fact, what became clear was but it's entirely elites. The ordinary American has never changed their populist beliefs. I mean, you could temporarily get an emotional reaction out of massive media manipulation and a short-term poll. But if you ask people, even right now in America, well, do you support, say, a no-fly zone or anything that could be interpreted as an act of war? Overwhelmingly, Americans say no. So the congressmen don't understand this. So people like Marjorie Taylor Greene was originally flirting around with being on the I stand with Ukraine side. And it probably didn't hurt that, the people running her investment trust leaked to her that they had made some nice defense industry stock purchases. But some of us were very critical of her related to that. Within a week, she had flipped positions. And it will shock the Republican establishment crowd. It will shock the editors at places like Breitbart. They still don't understand their own base. They still don't understand their own voter interest. And that's why there's going to be a blowback of all blowbacks to come down the road, especially if this has certain economic ramifications or if it expands at any scale in the U.S. And the old American tradition will come back to bear. I mean, it's like, why was George McGovern the anti-war candidate for the Democratic Party when he's from South Dakota? Well, he wasn't from San Francisco. He's from South Dakota because it's the old populist tradition, happened to be on the left in that case, but the populist tradition represented North and South Dakota, particularly because of Norwegian rural immigrants that settled here in the United States. Historically anti-war. It's like two groups that are the most anti-war in America, Appalachia and Norwegians. It's why Trump won. The Norwegian vote gave him Wisconsin. Some might say gave him Wisconsin twice, but one time it was recognized as such. As even the Russian ambassador to the United Nations declared about, how are we supposed to trust a country that stole an election from its last president? But that whole dynamic. So you still have this gap that the ordinary person often doesn't have their political opinions about international affairs represented at all in the court of public opinion, in the sense of whether it's the media, the intellectuals, the academics, the politicians. But going to your other questions, how did this sort of Atlanticist, neoliberal, internationalist, globalist policy elite end up monopolizing American public policy on foreign policy in a wide range of areas? And how is it that, and what is their ideology? And it dawned on me, like I was trying to figure out what appeared to me otherwise baffling and bewildering about their approach toward China, and also their approach towards, did they understand second order consequences of their Ukrainian intervention position? And it dawned on me, I was like, it's kind of shocking because I've been following like their internal Twitter threads and other discussions, because a lot of the people that are sort of right next to these groups of policymakers and decision makers are just blabbing away on social media. And some of their opinions just kind of shocked me that they saw China as the best way was somebody on my locals board described it. This is a group, think of a sort of a big spoiled kid, little 10-year-old. And this is sort of the globalist class. And they see China as their factory worker. They see the Mideast as their patrol station. They see the monarchs as their gas attendant. They see Central America as their housekeeper. They don't see these as independent, powerful countries. And this goes back to Obama's statement when he said, you don't have to worry about Russia. Their GDP is 1/10 of ours. Not understanding that's not where power comes from. And it really goes back to they're making Kissinger's mistake. Kissinger had 3 parables of power, and the third one was always wrong. First one was he who controls food supply controls his country. He who controls fuel supply controls the world. But then he said he who controls money controls it all. And he didn't understand the third. Only if you don't have the first two, the third doesn't matter. But it's this sort of mindset and elite that sort of emulated the British Empire. And I realized, like, how could people believe, like people like Blinken, kind of believe they could just dictate to China what's going to happen? It's one thing to think what you're going to do with Russia. It's another thing to think you're going to tell China what to do, and they're just going to say yes, sir, and just come hopping in like it's the old hotel there in Hong Kong, and it's tea time at 3:00. And but then it reminded me, I do recognize this mindset of an elite group that was totally disconnected from the world, from the reality of the world. And it reminded me of reading about Cecil Rhodes and the Round Table and the British elite, particularly as to their approach to America. It's like America was already on the verge of replacing them in manufacturing power. And yet he and his group still thought, oh, they're just going to be our colony in a few years. We're going to get to recolonize them just right around the corner. All we got to do is do this little global war thing and it will turn out great for all of us. And that's what I think these people think. And they have totally, from a realpolitik perspective, misread. They don't understand it. If they just reread Putin's 1997 thesis that, if that fuel and food are real power, and that if you restore that, you have real leverage. As he joked about the Germans a few years ago, he said, okay, they say they're going to get off of Russian fuel. Okay, what are you going to do? Wood? Well, who do you think has all the wood? So they live in a fantasy land of their own making that partially reflects a decaying elite, kind of Christopher Lasch, Revolt of the Elites, 1995, great book, great text, predicted a lot of this. But it also reflects an incredible blind. And they think like they're still in the 1990s. It's like they're watching West Wing on TV. China doesn't matter. Russia is our de facto colony. And they just think they can restore that with ease. And they haven't thought of short order, second order consequences. And that's why we have this pending disaster we're watching in live time, which might have the one upside of the failure of globalism. And you listen to Lavrov, or you listen to some Wall Street executives today saying, globalism might be over because of what this conflict has revealed. That might be the upside. But as you note, America would be much better off with that old domestic industry, less globalism, less global dependency, less dependency on the financial system, not having George Soros's model be the model of the world. We have a financial elite with IMF type institutions governing the world. But that doesn't mean there won't be some real economic pain, particularly for the West in the short order, nor does it mean that we can fully avoid. What we have to be wary of is that these idiots will give us a Dr. Strangelove ending.
Yeah, which we're closer to than I had ever conceived of or imagined. I mean, reading in the media here in Britain, I don't know whether it's been covered in the US, but there's a sort of tiger group apparently preparing for nuclear war in the event that things escalate. I mean, this is absolutely crazy stuff. This is absolutely ludicrously crazy stuff, and extremely disturbing. And it really does make you wonder how connected to reality these people are, and do they really understand what they're talking about and the kind of forces that they might unleash. And I have to say this, I also find it extraordinary that the hysteria which is coming out of Britain, and Britain, it seems to me, has been a very big part of the hysteria that has led us in this direction, has proved so infectious in the US. And what is this hold that we have over the American imagination in Britain? I mean, or am I exaggerating it? I mean, we have in Britain, all the way back to the time of the Napoleonic Wars, a fixation with Russia. If you read some of the sort of histories of the Crimean War, for example, and the build up to the Crimean War, you read all the articles that were appearing in the British media, and they're at that time in the early 19th century, and they're incredibly like what you read today. And many of the same tropes, the same themes, the same ideas, the beliefs that the Russians, just somebody that you can sweep away, and it's not going to be a real problem because, well, they're not really, up to taking us on. And that has become very embedded in the British mindset, and it's never gone away. But why are American elites so receptive to it? Is it because they're attracted to the British elite, its aristocratic culture in some way? Is it because they see Britain as a kind of model for running an empire? Didn't do as much good here, by the way, I should say. In my opinion, and in the opinion of many people, the empire was an absolute disaster for Britain. It exhausted us of our economic energies. It resulted in the decay of our industries. It strengthened elite institutions, which ultimately have proved profoundly corrupting and have weighed on our political system. But is it that the American elites see this and are attracted to it in some way? I just find it difficult to understand, given how much more powerful, how much richer, how much more entrepreneurial and vigorous America is compared to Britain. And I say that as somebody who is, let me say it again, somebody who loves his country very much.
I think it reflects a bifurcation in power. So the entrepreneurial side of American life, that it was economically dominant at different time periods, particularly late 19th, early 20th century, was not an Anglophile world, but the old money was. So your old money Manhattan, your old Ivy League institutions, deeply Anglophile world, the world, and they took over the WASP elite, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant for those at home, took over the intelligence apparatus and national security apparatus. And they were natural colleagues with the world John le Carré portrays of, in fact, they'll make an appearance in as we discuss later, what Putin means by the anti-Russia project of Ukraine and the complicity of U.S. and Western intelligence using publishing groups as a front for some of this anti-Russia project dating back to the 1980s, really, arguably even further. But you had, all these guys are guys like, David Atlee Phillips. They always got three names. It's that kind of crowd. So it's like I tell people, I know you guys are from Greece because, you're both named Alexander. So that's kind of a giveaway. But these guys are equally giveaways, and they're sort of, they're old sort of Brahmin, Beacon Hill mindset. It's the reason why there was always going to be a clash between the Kennedys and this group that sort of ran the original American deep state, because they grew up as Irish Catholics hating these kids, hating them from the time they were 6 years old. And so that was going to translate to other places once they got into positions of power. And of course, they end up both dead within 5 years, along with Martin Luther King. So I think that then it's also secondary to the think tanks and the institutions that get the money, and the way you get promoted in the press, the way you get promoted by publishers, the way you get promoted by these is you align yourself with deep state interests, and the deep state interests, or you can call it dual state, national security state, whatever anybody wants to call it. Deep state was originally the left's terminology for it, not the right. Trump just realized how easy it was and borrowed from it. But that's how you get to positions of power and prominence. Independent intellectuals here that aren't Anglophiles will not get promoted to the think tanks, will not get promoted to government positions of power, will not be promoted in the press with opinion columns. And that so I would call neoliberalism and Atlanticism and neoconservatism and a lot of these ideas is the intellectual architecture, but it's mostly the face for what is really a globalist agenda. In other words, when you can predict what's going to happen by what George Soros is doing and talking about easier than anybody else, you get a sense of whose agenda and whose group of agenda in terms of elite global interests that just believe, hey, look, if a small group of us run the world, that will make it a better place. And they really believe this. Bill Gates really believes this without any doubt. He's a control freak and a lot of other issues, but that's what these guys really believe. And Soros has been blatant about first we take out Putin, then we take out Xi. And I always found that the arrogance of that kind of shocking. It's like I have issues with China on a wide range of economic policies, and still curious about how the pandemic came about and some other things. But that I'm not naive to where I think, oh, China's. There was these people responding within these Twitter threads calling it a shithole country. And it's like, you can't be serious, right? We're not 1995. They're not 2% of the world's manufacturing. They're the number one world. They actually make things. They have productivity. Like Russia has things, oil, food, fuel, particularly fertilizer. China makes things. We should have figured that out during the pandemic when we couldn't get basic supplies because the supply chains are in China. It's like, how did they not see this? But if you look at them culturally, socially, and politically, like an old, Brahmin wasp, and you don't mind bringing in all the Irish Catholics because they're going to work in your mills for you, and you're not thinking maybe someday they'll replace us politically. It somehow doesn't cross through the brain. And because all you do is you see them as your servant, you see them as your factory worker. And when you see people that way, when you see whole nations that way, you're incapable of objective realpolitik analysis. And so I think the real reason for this is you have a globalist elite that has used these ideas to mask their own agenda. But the second is that the institutions of influence here overwhelmingly share those prejudices and preferences. And if you have a dissident opinion, you are attacked viciously. I mean, like Mitt Romney saying Tulsi Gabbard needs to be, looked at for treason because he raised the questions of biolabs in Ukraine. We're not fully to World War I insanity, where we had Palmer raids and Eugene V. Debs was in prison for making a speech. A existing congressman in Milwaukee was in prison for opposing the war. I mean, we've gone crazier in America. But as an illustration, when I pointed out that what Zelensky was doing was deeply problematic in a wide range of areas in Ukraine, I got a response of people who said, well, we put people in detention camps based on their ancestry connections, and they were celebrating this as if it was a good thing. So it gives a mindset. One last piece on the Zelensky speech. I was still startled that, what we have is these lazy screenwriters who are running in our foreign policy and our media misrepresentations of it. But did they have to really crimp from George Orwell's 1984? I mean, Congress was literally looking at him on the screen, almost identical to the 2 minutes of hate. I was like, am I seeing that? When I first saw that, I thought somebody's doing a meme, somebody's doing a joke. And then I was like, oh my God, these idiots actually replicated it. That's what I find most terrifying. Not their lack of conscience, but their inability to understand second order consequences, their incapacity to understand the real world from a realpolitik perspective. And last but not least, they really see strategic empathy, understanding what someone else thinks, regardless of whether you share their opinions, their policies, their goals, or their values. They see that very act as morally evil, as morally sinful. That you take a sort of an embubbled elite and you add to that safe space culture that says it's a virtue to not think with strategic empathy. It's a sin to use strategic empathy. Then you've got the exact recipe for disaster and debacle of the kind that birthed World War I.
And that's what we're seeing now. Before we get started on some more news of the day, Robert, where can people find you real quick?
Sure. At vivabarneslaw.locals.com. And I'm doing a lot of the exclusive commentary on the war in a hush hush series at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. To share some alternative narratives without getting banned, booted, or under the under any special reviews. At least I'm not in Ukraine. I mean, I'll give Gonzalo Lira credit. I would have got out of there. I would have found a train. Boom, Benito. I wouldn't have hung around. So credit to him for hanging around and continuing to speak out, even when the Daily Beast is writing their hit pieces. What's amazing is they reference you guys a very serious, important podcast, but they refuse to name you. Right? I mean, that's how you know it's a real hit piece. Like, okay, on this very serious, podcast that has this boutique niche listener of policymakers, but we won't name them because we don't want anybody going to their actual site or finding out who they are. And instead, we just want them to find out where Gonzalo Lira is. So and his thugs. I mean, it's
despicable what the Daily Beast did. Despicable, but good on Gonzalo. He's staying strong and safe. I highly recommend your Hush Hush series, Robert. I watch it and it's absolutely top notch. I mean, top notch. Robert, how do you see things going on right now in Ukraine and in Europe? Biden is in. Actually, they just wrapped up this NATO conference, and I believe he's going to be going to Poland. I believe after this, or he went to Poland beforehand, but they wrapped up the conference. The NATO conference. They came out with a few statements. We have some breaking news, guys. Alexander, Robert, from what I'm getting, the DPR has liberated the administration building in Mariupol, and Mariupol is now part of Donetsk People's Republic, and the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, and the State Duma deputies are already in Mariupol. I can't confirm this 100%, but this is what I am getting from two different sources. So it looks like Mariupol might be completely taken by the Russian army. Anyway, Robert, how do you see things? What's going on? What's Biden's game plan? What's Putin's game plan? And then Alexander, and let's just keep the conversation moving on what's going on in Ukraine.
Well, I bet some of those Chechens that are on the ground might have liberated some of those Azov guys from their physical bodies, but you know that's we'll see how that. There's a reason why those guys were sent into that part of the world. I mean, it's amazing how they're becoming sort of culture. I mean, after all the conflict between Chechnya and Russia, I mean, vicious terror campaign in the 2000s in the early stages of Putin's administration, that now they're becoming almost cultural icons and heroes like the old Cossacks in Russia. Is fascinating to watch. Also shows the genius of Putin, that he took a group that was a group associated with crime and terrorism for decades, really much longer than that in the Russian mindset historically. And now they're tough-minded, ferocious heroes, right? Kind of like the way the mountain men of early American society, particularly in Appalachia, were portrayed as this sort of dangerous rogue group of Davy Crockett types trying to fight bears and engage in eye gouging for fun, into tough mountain men who helped bring about the Revolutionary War. But I think this is what it was interesting to hear Lavrov confirm certain hypotheses that we had talked about, which was that this is really a global conflict between globalism and nationalism. What is the future of the world going to be the George Soros, Klaus Schwab, Hillary Clinton model, or is it going to be the Putin, Trump, Modi nationalism model, a model of independent sovereign countries governing their own affairs? And the assumption all along of the sort of internationalists and the globalists was, if we control the financial system and we make the whole world economically interdependent, then it goes back to Kissinger's third premise that if you control the money supply, you control the world. And they really believed that. And I think they believed it to such a degree that they didn't consider what happens if that's not true. What happens if that premise is false? And that's why we're seeing some of the panic out of the West in terms of, okay, maybe there's something else we can do, some other event we can provoke in Ukraine in order to get this to go a different direction. And how in the world is what's our uppity factory worker in China doing, saying they're not going to play ball? And then we got the uppity Indian servant, and they're not going to play ball. I mean, who are these people? And how is it that not a single country in Latin America, Central America, or Africa, or in the rest of Asia has joined our efforts outside of Japan? And Japan's trying to walk back its own positions because the Russians are like, screw it, we won't do a treaty. We won't talk about a treaty on the Northern Islands. We won't talk about certain deals if you want to play ball with the West. And Japan was like shocked, or at least voice shocked. So, where do these people live? So I think that this is a global conflict. That's what's really at risk or at issue in Ukraine. Doesn't have a lot to do. I agree with Lavrov. Doesn't really have a lot to do with Ukraine. It's just the manifestation and expression of it. And then I think militarily, what's happening on the ground is the Russians are getting what they want to get. And I'm sure there've been some setbacks in the rest. But what we talked about, the deep battle policy of Russia, which is totally different than the Western approach, has been since even before World War II. The Soviets didn't do mass bombing campaigns. Like they weren't bombing Dresden. That was us. They weren't nuking places. That was us. These sort of we did mass bombing, indiscriminate bombing of civilian infrastructure and civilian populations. That wasn't the Soviets. That was us. The Brits and the Americans really employed it very effectively, but controversially over time. And so I think that they always come in with multiple fronts. They use Maskarovka, and I wonder how much I want to explore with you guys how much this alternative hypothesis might explain some things, in the sense of Maskarovka is a little masquerade. Like I've been stunned watching Western so-called military experts act completely shocked at why they're getting very little intel out of Russia. And it's like, that's always Russia. They don't even tell their soldiers what they're doing until they're doing it. I mean, that's the whole mindset. That's why their soldiers get captured. It doesn't matter. They don't have any plans.
The other guys are doing TikTok videos.
Exactly. No, the Brits that go there, sitting there, playing their phone, and the Russians are like, so that's where you are. Bada boom. Let's meet hypersonic missiles. So you have all of that dynamic. They're not playing in the info war. They didn't think they could convince the West anyway. So why mess around in the info war? And they're getting banned everywhere anyhow. So who cares? But secondly, it's just not part of their military strategy. And I do wonder how much Putin was deliberately vague in order to confuse people as to what exactly he's going to do. And it seems to at least have effectively confused the Ukrainians, because they did come in, the Russians did come in on multiple fronts, and the Ukrainians are tied down. Their units in Odessa are sticking in Odessa. Their units in the West are sticking in the West. The units in Kiev are sticking in Kiev, while slowly and steadily the old Russian area of Ukraine is being completely taken over by the army. I mean, as you guys noted, the size of the United Kingdom. I mean, that's how much land they've taken in 3 weeks without using a mass bombing campaign, without using by going to great lengths to avoid civilian deaths. I mean, we have 1/10 of the number of civilian deaths in Ukraine that we had in Iraq at this same after 3 weeks of bombing in Iraq. I mean, it's extraordinary. So. So I think, I mean, and all the other aspects, like, I mean, when we were talking about it, how do you employ deep battle policy? One, you mislead your opponent as to what you're going to be up to. So you're going to keep everybody in the dark about what your real plans are. And there aren't going to be live updates on TikTok. Instead, Russian soldiers aren't going to be allowed to bring in their cell phones. The Ukrainians still keep repeating, oh, we intercepted some cell phone traffic. And it's like, they don't have cell phones. They were deliberately taken away from them for this reason. They didn't want a bunch of TikTok videos of idiots giving away positions. But number two, they would come in with multiple fronts. That's exactly what they did. Number three, that their focus would be on the whole theory and the premise of deep battle policy developed by the Russians in the 1920s because of the disaster of the Russo-Japanese War, and then the Great War, and the Russo-Polish War, and to some degree the Civil War, depending on how that's interpreted. And we have to completely shift our strategy. And the theory was all future wars will be wars of attrition. That's not wars of blitzing. If you understand wars of attrition, they're never thinking about, and Milley just lied to the world when he said, oh, they're going to take Kiev in 72 hours. That was a deliberate lie by our military establishment in order to set up a bogus expectation they knew would never be met, because the Russians never had that objective or an interest in the first place. And that isn't how they fight wars against armies. As you guys have been pointing out, there's differences between fighting insurgencies and fighting armies. And this is an army that they're focused on, not the Ukrainian population. It's an army. Now, certain units within that army, especially the Azov battalions that the Ukrainians decided to leave in Mariupol, so much for that. They're like the Klansmen of America South of the late 19th, early 20th century, which is they were used as a bunch of criminal sociopaths who were given a political permission slip to act out their pathological behavior. But once they become inconvenient, and if you're the Ukraine perspective, you might say, okay, whatever happens at the end of this, we don't really need these guys anymore. In fact, it might be kind of annoying to have them around. So we'll just leave them there. We'll tell them everything's going great. Don't worry. Aid might be coming, maybe not, but you'll probably beat them anyhow. Good luck. Right? There's some Klansmen ended up in jail and prison who thought they were protected by the local state governments. So much for that. But it's not like Nazis are great at reading history anyhow. But so I think you look at their deep battle policies, and then the last, it's all about cutting off supply chains, which is the first thing the Russians did. And they continue to do. Cut off fuel supply, cut off food supply, cut off the means of transport, dominate the air, dominate the seas. They were achieving everything they set out to do in some degree. I mean, they took the airport outside of Kiev in 24 hours after the invasion. I was like, this is failure? This is what failure looks like? We didn't take Baghdad until 3 weeks in. So and that was with a devastated army and a bunch of people, and an army that also just went underground. They just shifted their uniforms. Used to be Iraqi soldier uniforms, then it became some other uniforms, like ISIS down the road, amongst other ones. And then you had your Shia militias and all the rest. So I think the war is going pretty much as Russia planned. I think all these fatality estimates are ludicrous. Independent, neutral military observers have no bone in the fight at all, and they're like, what they're saying doesn't make sense. And they contrast it to coroner reports out of that, I won't be able to pronounce it correctly, but the city that they're fighting that's north in the Kherson region. The local journalists went to coroners, and they are finding hundreds and hundreds of dead Ukrainian soldiers on every single day. Then you add in, they're doing what, 200, 300 sorties a day? Coming in at night, boom, 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 boom. Taking out like people asked, why didn't they take out the bridges along the Polish border? One, they don't want to damage civilian infrastructure. Two, they don't want to damage refugees being able to exit the country. Three, and we can discuss this, I think Putin doesn't mind if he doesn't see far Western Ukraine as Ukrainian down deep. And there's good reason to think, or at least different than the rest of Ukraine. Put it that way. He doesn't mind if the Poles take it back. He thinks he'll let you guys deal with it. How did that work out for you in the interwar period? You might see how that terrorism might be redirected and that ultra nationalism take a different form. I mean, that's after all why Bandera was in prison. He whacked a Polish official. So they were killing Polish mailmen for crying out loud. I mean, the Holocaust collusion that they engaged in was, while very bad, obviously, for the local Jewish community, was the second group that got badly killed and hit were Poles. But Poles still see Liev, and they see it as naturally part of their empire since the Polish-Lithuanian days of the, and even before that. So I think that you look at what's taking place there, and they're just taking out. They're just waiting for the trucks and the rest to come in across the border in Poland, and then they just hit it each night. Boom, 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 boom. So I mean, that's why the mercenaries who went there that thought they were going to do live game of duty are trying to get the heck out of there, and even dressing up as women like the Azov battalion in Mariupol just to get the heck out of the country. Saying this was not what we signed up for. This is El Succo. This is what happens when you go to war because you saw a TikTok video. So I think all of that is happening as planned, and then economically, it's going even better than I think Putin could have anticipated. I mean, that was the other giveaway. I thought it was great, Alexander, you citing the Financial Times, because where you're going to get the most honest reporting, if you get it from anywhere, it's going to be people writing to the investor class. Because you can lie to the suckers and the saps. You got to be careful about lying to the investor class. You wonder, why did Putin leave up to $300 billion in reserves in Western banks? And then you realize, one, how he can play around with the he has real power. It's not the dollar, it's the gas. And he can say, I want the gas in rubles. I want the gas in gold. I want he has more power. But the second part was, and I think he also enhanced the argument for distrust of the Western financial system by leaving money there. If he hadn't left a lot of money there, it doesn't have the political impact to the rest of the world. And Lavrov keeps repeating this, oh my God, you look at what they did. They stole all this money, terrifying the rest of the world. We better get out of the Western financial system today. But the third is, of course, as I told people, it is likely that they were going to pay off that Russian debt, because look at who the money goes to. The money isn't going to Russians. It's big Western institutions and investors that own that debt. They're the ones who are going to get stiffed if no money is paid. And so what did very quietly the U.S. do? Well, we'll release and approve those funds for those interest payments. So and maybe Putin was banking on that all along. But you look at the ruble. I mean, one giveaway that the media narrative in the West was patently nonsense, aside from the fact you don't have to engage in censorship if you're actually winning substantively, is watching the investor groups. It's like the ruble dropped all the way from 80 baht up almost over 150 at one point. It hit 154. And that's what they were expecting, the 1999 Russian financial crisis, where it lost 75 to 80% of its value for a sustained time period. And instead, even before Putin announced the ruble oil deal, the ruble had been going back up, back up, back up. I mean, I think it was about 102, 105, somewhere around there before he announced it. And it was like, okay, somebody in the investment world thinks this is going very differently than the Blinken boys think. And so I think that Russia's in a position to win this war militarily and economically. Will suffer some short-term economic hits, but they are not going to implode. And by the end of it, they'll have a stronger. If you're Putin and you wanted to build a stronger domestic manufacturing base to replace certain imports, and you wanted to and not be dependent internationally, if you didn't like how your youth generation celebrated through big tech and Western culture, the Netflix, the TikToks, all the Facebooks, the Instagrams, you didn't like that culture. I mean, he made a speech basically saying that you can have all the faux gras and the French Riviera homes and the partying in Miami and your gender freedoms, which is a reminder. He's not so much a big fan of gay rights, obviously, still, but that you want, but you need to come home now. That he couldn't have done that on his own. He needed the West to do it for him. The West has now created, as you mentioned, the federal banker, the central banker there said, look, now we're going to be able to have to domestically recreate these products, rebuild our domestic manufacturing base, because now it's economically competitive and actually necessary to do so. There'll be some interruptions in the supply chain for a year or two, but once it's up and going, they'll actually be a stronger domestic economy than they were before. Their food and fuel costs are not skyrocketing in domestic inflation, just like they didn't in 2014, 2015, because they make their own food and fuel. And then third, culturally, he's got a huge achievement. He's hated this Western attachment, Western attention, in the sense of particularly woke culture. And now he's got the West to cut off his population from it. And if he ever wanted to make the point, they really hate us. They really want to destroy us, this elite, this group. That's been proven in spades, as chess players can't play, tennis players can't play, musicians can't do performances, students are being threatened with expulsion at colleges. Russians are seeing it in live time, while they get the stories of the refugees from Mariupol, which are even worse than many of them thought it would be. So that's my sort of brief.
I think of everything Robert said, Alexander, and I just think judo. Judo. Everything that Putin's employed.
Very much so. That's part of why he studied it. Part of it was to get rid of those hyper energetic, slightly criminal tendencies he had as a kid, and to channel them in a more productive and effective way. But yes, he clearly has thought ahead at multiple stages. And I do think the timing of it has been hinted at Lavrov. I think they did think it was inevitable, relating to the summer article he wrote in 2021, where he said Ukraine is being used as an anti-Russia project. And in particular, him saying that anti-Russia project was equal to a weapon of mass destruction. When you use that language, that means you're going to do something about that sooner or later. But I think the timing, they've kind of hidden because they were hiding part of their military agenda. But Lavrov has kind of hinted at it, which is that the reason why they went in now, they might not have gone in right now. I think they would have gone in if Hillary Clinton had been elected president. Was a combination of Biden being elected, because he's constantly referenced not the United States, but Biden's administration in the United States meant we had no chance with the West. They were going to wage full-scale war on us. But was that massing of that army outside of Donbass, which the people in the West still haven't explained. In fact, they don't even talk about. What in the world were such a huge unit doing right outside Donbass? And it explains what Biden administration was up to, because I didn't understand why they kept predicting war and invasion, aside from this being a fictional version of Putin, that he wanted to recreate the Soviet Union and recreate the Russian Empire. And they misquote him and misstate him. There was people who did a whole video about how Putin's wrong about the history of Ukraine because they misunderstood what he said. He said Lenin created Ukraine's borders. The Bolsheviks created Ukraine's borders. He didn't say the Bolsheviks created Ukrainianism or Ukrainians. That would be ludicrous. But they misconstrue it, misportray it, and then create a straw man to sort of try to counter. But in that sort of broader anti-Russia project that once he identified as a weapon of mass destruction, I think Biden was pushing, they're going to invade because they knew Ukraine was going to try to purge the Donbass. And they wanted to contextualize that when Russia came in, they likely assumed right after they went in to purge the Donbass, that it would be portrayed as, oh, Russia's invading like they've been predicting for weeks. And Putin just decided he wasn't going to sit by and watch the Donbass get purged. It's like, screw it, we're going in now. But we're going to stay vague as to our objectives because that maximizes our political leverage and maximizes our deep battle policy. And it's worked. I mean, they completely isolated the units in the east that they want to, within Mariupol and within these regions, which are the hardest core, vicious, ass-off components. And at the same time, I guess that army's still just sitting there and is slowly, steadily being encircled and cut off from air support, cut off from sea support, cut off from ground transport support, while they're getting less and less food and fuel, which means they're sitting ducks, is what it is. So it's been extraordinary to watch.
I'm completely in agreement with pretty much everything you've been saying, Robert. And I'm going to say something else. I think that yesterday, at least in Britain, and Britain has been the great, as I said, the driver of much of this. Yesterday, one sensed, as I was saying right at the start of this program, a sudden shift in the mood here. I think finally the penny dropped that the war isn't going well and that Ukraine is actually losing. And that's why you got that interesting article in the Financial Times and other articles like that. You start to see the nervousness, the fear that the war isn't going to plan. But even more important, the fear that the economic war of attrition is going horribly wrong. We've now had the British government formally admit that Britain is going to experience the biggest fall in living standards since modern records started in the 1950s. 2022 is going to be the year when Britons are going to see their living standards drop more than they've ever done. Now, this is something that has created shockwaves across the political class here. You can see, if you know how to read British newspapers, you can sense it. And of course, they don't want to admit that it's the sanctions policy that's bringing it about. The Office for Fiscal Responsibility, or whatever it's called, sort of hints at that fact, but it doesn't really face it right, fair and square. But of course, everybody in the political system understands that. They all expected that when the sanctions were announced, when they went against the central bank, when they imposed the SWIFT sanctions, all of those sanctions, that the whole Russian economy would collapse like a house of cards, because even more than in the United States, the British economy is based on money. We have the financial community in the City of London. The City of London is proportionately a much bigger part of the British economy than the financial system is in the United States, because for all the fact that the American economy has to a great extent been financialized, you are still a big continental economy. You still have agriculture, you still have industry, you still have lots of things which employ millions of people. In Britain, we are very centered on the financial system, on the City of London. So we tend to think very much like Kissinger said, that, who controls the money controls the world, because ultimately that's what we have. That's what we understand. So the assumption was financial system in Russia would collapse. The economy would collapse. There'd be hyperinflation. There'd be a coup by the oligarchs. We're going to go after the oligarchs. We're going to take their property. We're going to seize their yachts. We're going to confiscate their football clubs. We're going to throw due process out of the window because, well, we're targeting these people. And to be straightforward about it, we don't have that concern for due process that you do in the United States, because we don't have a written constitution here. We were going to do all of these things, and then we would achieve very quickly the objective that we've long hankered for, which is political change in Russia, a return back to the 1990s. And now suddenly, over the last few days, and especially yesterday, you could see the penny, as we say in Britain, has dropped. We've suddenly understood, hold on, their financial system isn't imploding. Their currency is, especially within Russia itself, is stable. Hyperinflation isn't coming. Now, Elvira Nabiulina hasn't resigned from the central bank, even though the British media twice reported that she had done so. And on the ground in eastern Ukraine, we're beginning to understand exactly the things that you said, that the military situation there is completely different from what we realized. And by the way, can I just quickly add on the subject of bombing of cities, of bombing populations? It was not something that the Americans came up with. We started it. We began it. We tried it out in Iraq. The British did in the 1920s. And of course, in the Second World War, it was the British who bombed Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, all of these cities. And the Americans, again, for reasons I can never understand, learn from us. As you absolutely rightly say, the Russians they go a different way. They don't bomb cities. They don't bomb civilian centers. They don't even target the political leadership. What they do is they go after the supplies, the logistics, the fuel, the ammunition, the holding areas of the troops, so that gradually the spearhead of the enemy's forces begins to get cut off. It runs out of ammunition, out of supplies, out of food. You saw that happen in the First World War. So in the Second World War, sorry. You also saw it happen in Syria, and eventually it has an effect. And in a war of attrition like this, what happens is the collapse eventually comes, and when it comes, it's sudden.
And the other aspect of that is Western media coverage. Aside from Americans' deep fear, well, American politicians' deep fear of American soldier casualties dramatically influencing an air-friendly approach, is that it's also been particularly fascinating watching this one. In the West, whenever we've done massive air raids, it generally has been they focus on the bomb. Right? They oh, look at that airplane, look at that. But remember all the media coverage when we did when Trump did his bombing of an empty airport? I'll give him credit. He understood the theatrics of war. It's like call him in advance, make sure nobody's there. But the media's gonna eat this stuff up. And it did, because they love, oh, look at that bomb, look at that beautiful missile, look at that. That's always the focus. Now in this war, it's no focus on the hypersonic missile. The first time it's ever seen. And of course, old Joe can't help himself. He's supposed to stay on script. He's like, yeah, that's same as everything else, except we just don't have any defenses against it. Well, that's a minor difference, Joe. But is that they focus on the consequences, right? It's burnout buildings. It's blown up shopping malls. It's blown up centers. So blown up hospital. It's all consequence. No fan. Look at that beautiful missile. Look at those amazing airplanes. Look at those amazing bombs. Remember the smart bomb, Iraq? Look at that. It can go right down there. Precision. I had someone respond to that who said, oh, we have precision bombing now, Barnes. Well, the civilian casualties don't happen when we do massive air bombing. It's like, I get that was a line out of Wag the Dog. I mean, the actual line from the movie. About what a crock that was. So I think that I agree with everything that you outlined, and the only real question is, what are the second order ramifications? What is the probability that the West does something insane, either in terms of escalating economic conflict with China and India, or trying to trigger World War III by either. Yeah, I mean, clearly the Azov battalion types and these Ukrainian. I mean, people should ask themselves, what does it tell you about a culture that medical experts feel comfortable talking about how they're running medical care for Russian POWs and go on TV and brag about how they've ordered their doctors to castrate them all because they're animals? That tells you something about the mindset. Not only they're objective, but that they think that would be popular. With the audience that they're talking to. These, gypsies, Romanian gypsies getting tied up to poles in certain parts of Ukraine and then videotaped and filmed and broadcasted on TikTok for public humiliation purposes. It's the mindset that Ukraine unleashed, beginning with the color revolution, which legitimated the kind of behavior we saw during the Nazi era, because they glamorized the same people that did it back then. Yeah. I mean, they took what Putin means by the anti-Russia project is they took this virulent form of Ukrainian nationalism that was not the dominant Ukrainian nationalism at all, that represented this tiny region in far western Ukraine that had never, most of its history, been part of the rest of the area in terms of governance, that tied its history back to the Kievan Rus, and most of it called themselves Ruthenian, not even Ukrainian. It's still weird when people say I'm a borderlander. I still find that kind of odd as a form of nationalism, but okay, because that's all Ukraine means is borderlands. But they were mostly part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire and different Polish dukes. That Bandera grew up under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was Greek Catholic. He's not even Orthodox. So you have to this day, Greek Catholic dominates that religious orientation in the Galicia region. And they mostly spent their time obsessed with taking out the Poles, and only became anti-Russian later. But Bandera wasn't even known in most of central and eastern Ukraine, according to the CIA's own internal documentation, when they looked at Bandera in the early 1950s, late 1940s. Of course, we went, the West went into business with him. I mean, the West used him against the Soviets, so we went into bed with these. It was always the Nazis and the fascists we aligned with. And you can kind of see why. They have information. They're ruthless and aren't limited by moral conscience, and they're going to hate the commies. So, but the problem is blowback. What happens when you align with these people? Just look at certain operations and look at what happened in Italy and some other places, and you can figure out that was no bueno strategy. But this sort of eclectic group. And then in the 80s, sort of the as part of the Cold War project, there was a Ukrainian institute at Harvard that Harvard has long time spook ties at that in multiple ways in terms of the CIA national security establishment. And they publish a book that takes the things like the Soviet famine and re-script it as a Ukrainian genocide, which mostly hadn't appeared in any scholastic book or contemporary journalistic reports in the 1920s and 1930s. When this happened in 1932 and 1933, really the second famine, the 21-22 one was worse, at least arguably, according to certain Ukrainian traditional historians. There's no reference to this being a Ukrainian genocide. This is about it being a Soviet famine. Now, disproportionately impacted the Kulaks and the Cossacks, both of whom Stalin had said he was going to wage either. He was going to decossify parts of the Soviet Union. He was going to remove the kulaks as a class, these independent peasants. And so you can argue about that, but that's not Ukrainian genocide. And yet it comes out of Harvard. And where does it come from? It comes from Cold War connected books. Indeed, the leading author who writes a second book that validates it is a famous UK author that you dig into. And he got his founding at the Foreign Office in the late post-World War II period, working for that wonderful little information group that owned publishing entities and the rest. That was purely an MI6 front organization and got exposed in the early 1980s. But he was still part of that whole culture. And all of a sudden this becomes part of the mythical narrative, becomes this far Western Ukrainian narrative, becomes the Ukrainian nationalism narrative. And then after the Color Revolution, president gets elected, and he puts it all into institutionalized form. It's on memorials. That's why he makes Bandera a national hero. But also the Ukrainian genocide becomes critical. And what's that story? That story is not that it was a Soviet genocide. That story was not that Stalin was a Georgian, not a Russian. That story was not that local Ukrainians were principally responsible. Ukrainian Bolsheviks, but local Ukrainians nonetheless. Instead, it becomes Russians tried to kill us because we tried to be free. Russians tried to commit mass genocide because we tried to be free. It's something that the West have helped create and invent. And that's the anti-Russia. That was the beginning of the anti-Russia project. And it's not a coincidence. It goes deeply into action after they do the Color Revolution to reverse the election of 2004. And then when they're unhappy in 2014, it just enhances. And it was very interesting to hear Lavrov say, he goes, look, we're going to have about 20 years to repair relations with Ukraine because they've been subject to 2 decades of propaganda. And there's a whole generation there that hates Russians and has no idea about the actual history between Ukraine and Russia. The whole history of there's reasons for resentment, but not the unusual views of the far west of Ukraine. And that's also why I think Putin could care less if that part of Ukraine was no longer part of Ukraine.
Robert, I agree with you about Putin's views about Western Ukraine. And here I think it's useful to go back to that speech he gave on, I think it was the 21st of February, the day when there was that National Security Council meeting and when he announced that he was going to recognize the 2 breakaway republics of the Donbass, because this part of his speech has been completely overlooked. But he very carefully distinguished Western Ukraine from the rest of Ukraine. He said that that the Bolsheviks basically created the borders of Ukraine by adding various parts of various different countries to this Bolshevik created Republic of Ukraine that they had within the Soviet Union. And obviously he mentioned Russian territories like Donbass, eventually Crimea. But he also specifically referred to Polish Ukraine, to Western Ukraine, which he said had been added to Ukraine by Stalin. And when I read that, I said to myself, he is actually saying, in effect, that this isn't part of the Ukraine that he is interested in. He recognizes that it's fundamentally and profoundly different. And he says to himself, he's saying basically to the Russian people, well, this isn't part of our world. It's not part of what the Russians sometimes refer to as the Russian world, the Ruski Mir. It can go its own way. It can sort out its own problems. it can take it can go its own direction. We're not interested in it. Can I just add something else, which is, of course, I actually studied this period of Soviet history when I was at university. This is in the late 70s, early 80s. This is long before we had any suggestion that the famines, the collectivization famine in the Soviet Union, was part of a deliberate plan by Stalin to and the Russians to starve the Ukrainians. What it was the Soviet Great Leap Forward. The Chinese carried out, Mao Zedong did this massive program in China in the 1950s to create sort of localized industries based around communes. It was a sort of extraordinary, ruthless, crazily conducted thing. And it resulted in a famine that affected every part of China. Collectivization in the Soviet Union was the same. It affected every single part of the Soviet Union where it was applied. And when I was studying this thing, and of course this was before we got the full Soviet archives open, but I think it's been validated. The republic which actually suffered worst of all from this was not Russia, it was not Ukraine, it was what is now Kazakhstan. There, in fact, it was far worse, far harsher than it was in Ukraine. And who were the people who suffered most? Well, of course, Kazakhs and Russians.
Yep. And I understand the scale and scope of it. Like, some people have been asking about what's the contemporary Ukrainian attitude towards Russians. And I said it's really changed, and it's going to vary. Like, the British reporter who was in that border town that's heavily Ukrainian is very. You could get the sentiment is still very anti-Russian.
Yeah.
And there's this mythology in the West that Russia's unaware of this. And Lavrov made very clear they're intimately well aware of it. It's part of it's what Putin meant in part. He's like, you've taken this country that is a natural fraternal brother for most of its population and people, and you've turned them into hating us. 2 minutes of hate has been taught to them now for 20 years. And you've got a whole generation under 40 that buys every ludicrous theory, that has no doubts. The ordinary Western-oriented Ukrainian in Kiev has no doubts that the famine was a Ukrainian-directed genocide because of all the propaganda for 15 plus years. Despite, as you note, all the historical evidence refutes that and rebuts that. The best illustration is that, as you exemplify, the China, Mao did the exact same thing. So in his great leap backwards, he had a couple of those, kept leaving the wrong direction. But then the solution was, go torture your teacher with the Cultural Revolution. Let's hope we don't have to see one of those. But I think that this complete divorce from history that's in the Western public discussion. The only question I have is, how much do the elites share it? How much do they too not know it? I mean, Soros has been in Ukraine since before the Ukraine was independent. He set up shop there in 1990. It was one of his dream operations. And I'm sure part of him is thrilled with all of this, though I don't think they anticipate. I don't think they cared whether Ukraine fell or rose or was whooped out or not. It was just a pretext to go after Russia. That's what it was always about. But I don't think they anticipated that the whole world outside of Europe would reject him. And I don't think they anticipated that Russia would survive just fine economically. And I don't think they anticipate. I think they did anticipate that Ukraine's army would lose. I think there's a few Blinken still going around people. Oh, well, Ukraine's going to win. He's doing that right now in Washington. He's going around these cocktail circuits, telling people he's going to at cocktail parties. And it's like, what? I mean, you're a laughable idiot. This makes Baghdad Bob look normal. When he sat there, Americans aren't coming in. Oh no, we're whooping them on the battle. Oh yeah, we're destroying. American units are deserting. Like all these lunatic Russian stories. Like, I mean, one of the latest ones was he had one of these think tank people say, the Russians are over half their soldiers have frostbite. They're not ready to deal with the cold of Ukraine. And it's like, one, it's not that cold right now in Ukraine. It barely drops below freezing on most nights in most parts of the country. Two, they're Russians. You think they're not ready to handle a little cold? It's like, oh my, where are these people? And they say this publicly as if, you would think the embarrassment would be like, whoa. But that shows you how unreflective and disconnected from history and strategy they are. And I think we're watching it in live time. Ray Diallo just said, transition to the currency conversation, he thinks the U.S. dollar's currency days are numbered. He says it's just a matter of when. He says, but that this event turned the spigot, and that it's going. Now, what's interesting is it may not be the Chinese yuan. What China and Russia are talking about is creating a currency that's not dependent on any individual state, a currency that's up against a basket of commodities, maybe also multiple, maybe gold, maybe other things. Luke Groman has been talking about gold could be used as a reserve asset. You wouldn't even need to use it as a reserve currency because there's ways in which they can. But either way, they're going to set up a system that is outside of dollar domination, which means the whole intention of a digital currency, a Western-oriented elite, it was going to be a global digital currency, in my view. It wasn't just going to be the dollar. It was going to be a IMF kind of currency.
Yeah.
Those plans have taken a massive setback because the rest of the world is going to have zero interest in that. Yeah. It's like after watching this, you're taking guys, billionaires, $200 million yachts because they made the mistake of parking it in the wrong port. You're taking away a guy's football team because of his ancestry. I'm going to use your digital currency where you could cut me off tomorrow at the moment of a keystroke. They've done institutional damage to themselves, much as they did, I think, in the pandemic by overreaching, by misreading what was going to happen here. Is I think where it's going. At least I hope so, because the alternative is not only globalism, but let's say they, as Medvedev, I'm mispronouncing his name again, but pointed out the other day, he's like, why does the West want a Russia with chaotic organization, deeply injured, pointing all of its nuclear weapons at it? Because it's like, why is this a sane policy that you seem to have? And I don't think any of us want that.
No, exactly not. That is entirely right. I have to say, I do think that this is the pivotal moment. This is the inflection point. We're going to see after this. It's going to be either full speed globalization with all that comes from it, or, which I think is far more likely, the end of the globalization project as we have seen it. I think that this is the moment when it basically starts to it collides against reality and it falls apart.
Which is far more likely? Can you clarify?
I think the second one, the far more likely. I think it is the failure of the globalization project. I mean, I think what's happened is it's confronted realities. I've always said it is a fundamentally unreal project, a utopian one. And this is reality, and reality always smashes through. That's what always happens, and it is happening now. And I think the point that Robert was making earlier, that ultimately it's food and energy much more important than money, because money, after all, is pliable. Money can lose value very quickly. I mean, you can find all kinds of old banknotes of all kinds of old current countries, the Tsarist Empire, pre-World War I Germany. Once upon a time, those banknotes had actual value. You could go into a shop and buy things with them. Now they're of value only to collectors. So, I mean, people got to understand that money ultimately matters to the extent that people have faith in it. If you destroy that faith, then of course it quickly loses that power. But you cannot dispense with food and energy. You need those two things. They are essential for civilized life.
George Gammon put it's like, if you get mad at a restaurant and you're like, well, I'm going to boycott that restaurant. What happens if all the restaurants get together and boycott you? Yeah. And they're the only places where you can eat. I mean, that's what that 1997 Putin thesis was. It's like, this is real power. We start to own our own food and fuel. We develop it extensively, and that's how we can create a secure Russia. And it was and the other thing that's being challenged, as you point out, is really fiat currencies itself. The critics of fiat currency has always been, the old currencies were almost all based on some independent source of value, gold or something else. This is not. These are just fiat currencies since the second Bretton Woods, early 1970s. A little bit petrodollar, but otherwise, but not quite independently. But you can't go get some gold for it. You can't take your dollar and get oil for it. Yeah. And so I think they misunderstood that, because like all the libertarian worlds and the crypto types the Bitcoin folks, they're looking at this as a great opportunity because they see an opportunity for the rest of the world to recognize what they have long recognized, which is fiat currencies in the control of a state are inherently dangerous, inherently unreliable, inherently untrustworthy, because they have no independent valuation and the state can declare what they want with it. And that's where, like, you're seeing this discussion and this shift, not just to a new reserve currency, but one that's not tied to any nation, which of course China wants anyway, because China doesn't want to have to run the trade deficits necessary to support the yuan as the world's global currency. They don't want to repeat America's mistake. But it's also means they know it's more trustworthy. I don't have to rely on the China's government or the Russian government if I have a currency based on an independent basket of commodities that it's tradable for at any given time. And I think that would globally be better for the world economy. Now, in the short term, as you noted, with Britain taking the biggest living standard hit in the era of keeping statistics in Britain on that issue, that's the problem for the U.S. The dollar, we have like these people don't really, they're very much like the customers at the country club who don't create or produce anything. They're going there and they just expect the services. And they think because they're the members of the club. Our economy is almost 70% or more consumption. We don't produce anything anymore. Not at the scale. Now we have the capacity to produce extraordinarily so. We have a lot of natural resources that make us in a much better position than lots of Europe is. Europe's committing economic suicide. They don't have the oil reserves that we have. They don't have the natural resources that America has. They don't have the food supply we can, just turn on the spigot and have. The spigot will take a little while to actually warm up, as some people figured out during the pandemic lockdowns or thereafter. But the dollars allowed us to buy things cheaper than they really are. The dollars allowed us to consume. And what happens is you get into a bad loop, because the loop that happens is, okay, you don't have, not only that, it's allowed us to inflate asset bubbles in the stock market and in real estate. What happens when the dollar is no longer allowing us to buy things cheaper than they actually are? What happens when the stock market takes a hit? What happens when real estate market takes a hit? I mean, to give an example, last year in America, for the first time, more people made more money off the increase. The ordinary median household made more money off the increase in the value of their home than they did in their entire annual income. And we had a near record level of amounts of people that actually translate in the real economy because in refis. We're almost at the same level we were in 2008 in the sense of people using their house to fund a lifestyle. What happens if all that collapses, which it quickly can, right? Putin's point is oil ain't going nowhere. Wood ain't going nowhere. Fuel, fertilizer ain't going nowhere. Wheat ain't going nowhere. These rare minerals we have that all of you need, they ain't going nowhere. Whereas the stock market can disappear overnight. The value of the dollar can disappear overnight, and historically often has. The value of the real estate bubble can disappear overnight. These are not based on productivity. These are not based on goods and services. These are not based on real raw materials. And because of that, and what happens in the cycle is all of a sudden you don't have enough discretionary income to spend on consumption, so you spend less on consumption. The economy is so driven by consumption that leads to layoffs, so more people don't have money to spend on consumption. You can see the quickly negative cycle we get into. And there are people out there looking at this that say America faces a realistic risk of an economy worse than the Great Depression in terms of its impact on the population that could come suddenly because we have totally mismanaged these policies. And now I think 10, 20 years from now, if we shift to domestic manufacturing, developing our own resources, not only are we more independent, because what the great myth of globalism was, interdependence would increase peace and reduce war. It's just the opposite. It's increased war and reduced peace. When we're independent, what do we care who's running Syria, who's running Iran? What do we care? We got our own oil, we got our own gas, we got our own food, we got our own everything. We make our own goods. That's also always been good for working classes everywhere. You make things, one, you have more social, cultural, emotional pride, which improves your local cultural and social life and personal psychological life. So you don't have the record-setting suicide and drug addiction rates we currently face, particularly in white working class communities, all working class communities that used to be manufacturing hubs in America just 2 decades ago. You'll listen to Bruce Springsteen's Youngstown song about Youngstown going down. But that's going to take probably several decades. And the irony of all of it is the people who will get hit the most are these lazy elites. They will be the ones, as Putin said, maybe you won't get your foie gras anymore. Maybe you won't get the vacation at the French Riviera anymore. Maybe you won't have your beloved gender freedoms anymore. But it's time to come back home to the Russian Papa Bear.
That's why they hate him so much, the elites.
Yes.
That's why they hate Putin so much. Alexander, comment on what Robert said. Also, we haven't talked about, Robert hinted on it, we haven't talked about Europe. Europe is the big loser in all this. Why did they commit suicide like this?
Absolutely. Well, we'll come to Europe, but can I just say, I mean, the big thing I did at university and after was I studied American history. And can I just say, in its heyday, which goes all the way up to the 60s, the United States accounted for a much bigger share of world industrial production and manufacturing than China does today. I mean, we think of China as this manufacturing colossus. America was much bigger, much stronger. And of course, it produces extraordinary quality products and things that, you just could not imagine. And, at one point after the Second World War in the 50s, it accounted for more than half the world's industrial production. I mean, that's the scale of industrial power that the United States had, and which, by the way, I believe it can achieve again, because it has the economies of scale, which no European country does. It has the technology and the scientific resources. They're still there. And of course, it has the enormous entrepreneurial drive of its population, which I also believe is still there. And by the way, I studied this very much again. And I remember, I'm going to say this very quickly. I did a study comparing the textile industries in the United States and in Britain in the 1920s. And it was so interesting to see how the British antiquated small mills, gentlemanly capitalism, with the British mill owner, he has his country house, he has his Silver Ghost, his Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost car, he buys his suits at Savile Row, he's very content to live off the incremental income that's come from the, this business that has been built up by his great-grandfather and grandfather, and he lives the English aristocratic lifestyle. And at the same time, you have the Americans. They're driving, they're building, they're combining factories. They're doing R&D. They're doing the most extraordinary things, and they're just leaving the British far behind. That was the sort of British contrast between the American drive that they had then and the sort of British gentlemanly capitalism. And what's happened disastrously is that somehow, in some way, British gentlemanly capitalism was imported into the United States. And it's always important to say that Britain, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, up to the First World War, it also had its kind of globalization project. And what did it do? It caused British industrial power to atrophy. It became over-dependent on finance, and we had, as I said, this sort of country club capitalism take over, which was, again, ultimately parasitic on the economy, and which we still have struggles with to this day. So that's what I just wanted to make, those observations. I think America, with its economies of scale, its abundant natural resources, its ability to feed itself, which it can do, it can rediscover those skills. No European country can do that. None. We just don't have those economies of scale in Europe. We're not resource rich in the way that the United States is. We don't have the scientific and technological skills that the United States does. We haven't in Europe created a single analog to any of the tech companies that you have in the United States. For example, we're not at the forefront of microprocessor production. We're not, we are nowhere. And what have we just done to ourselves? We have alienated the country which could have been our economic resource hinterland, which is Russia, because we've cut ourselves off ultimately from the country that could have provided us with the energy, the food, all of those things that could have given us the depth and balance of resources that we might have had, and which might have helped us in some way to sort of find the kind of routes forward that the United States still has on the strength of its own resources. And what were we doing in Europe? Getting mixed up in Ukraine. What were the Germans doing? What were the British? Surely they should have known how sensitive an issue for the Russians Ukraine would be. So why talk about Ukraine one day entering NATO? Why talk about Ukraine one day entering the European Union? Why foist that association agreement on Ukraine? Why constantly say, harp on about the fact that the Russians have no right to any opinion about Ukraine, or whether it joins NATO or the EU or not? Surely, especially the Germans, especially a German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, Olaf Scholz, should have known better than anybody else. In Ukraine, you tread carefully. You're treading on a territory which is very important to the Russians. And given the underlying economic and trade realities, that relationship with Russia is vital for our future. We have cut ourselves off, not just from our economic hinterland in Europe, but from our future. The United States will come through. It has the resources to do it. It has the entrepreneurial drive to do it. Europe, we are going to become a backwater. I've said this previously in earlier programs. That is what we're going to become. We have destroyed our economic future as a result of this, because the Russians will never trust us again.
I mean, basically, it'll be kind of like a Disneyland with a little bit of history.
Yeah.
Let's go to Paris and see the fancy buildings. Let's go to this,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you can still do the food like a tourist location.
Exactly.
You get your little foodstuffs, you got your little rarities that you make locally,
Yeah.
you got your little history. But that's kind of what it becomes. I mean, I think their globalist great fear was a Trump-Putin alignment that said, let's restore national power, national sovereignty, and away from this international globalist world order. And that's why I think it's not a coincidence that the same people that are pushing and propagating this war, the same people that set it up and established it going back decades, are the same people that are at the center of Spygate, at the center of Russiagate, at the center of Ukrainegate. It's not a coincidence that there's this continuation. And it also reflects, I mean, the irony is, for some of my militaristic, war-loving, conservative compadres out there, Trump's vision may actually come to fruition thanks to Putin. If he actually succeeds at what he's doing, because it will enable Trump to do what he was trying to do. Like, you look at Trump's approach to China, and that might be a good transition to that conversation too, as the impracticality of what they're talking about. Trump didn't go to China like Blinken did at the very beginning of the administration and lecture them like a wayward factory worker about their internal policies.
Yeah.
He almost never talked about the Uyghurs. He almost never talked about Hong Kong, never talked about almost any of that. His focus was, China, you're an economic threat to us because of how you devalue your currency and how we're engaged and how you've used the WTO to take our manufacturing base and put it there. And I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to do escalating tariffs until either we get the revenue from the tariffs or we start to do replacement and do domestic manufacturing here. But reality is, his ability to achieve that vision was always much more limited within that structure. It is much more possible in a structure that's no longer internationally interdependent anymore. That's no longer, the Trumpian's vision of America is much more capable to occur if Putin wins this global nationalist conflict than it was ever before it. And so, but I do think in terms of China, it's like, what are we going to cut off? It's like they were talking about India. It's like, okay, India sends us things like pharmaceuticals. India doesn't really need us. We need India. We can't produce some of these things quickly or definitely not as cheaply. I mean, it's like some people are saying, well, we can replace the fertilizer that we're going to lose from Russia and Belarus. And it's like, yes, we can. It's just going to be a lot more expensive. But it's like Europe saying, well, we'll just get off of Russian gas. It's like, okay, your bill's about to be 10 times higher. How competitive is German industry going to be if its energy bill is 10 times higher than it was before? So I can't. I mean, it just reminds me of their incompetence. Like, I mean, people tend to want to think that if there's any consequence, like even James Corbett's kind of followed into this, if there's any consequence, that consequence was intended by bad actors. And I'd say if you look at throughout human history, 90% of the time, the bad consequence was something they didn't anticipate at all because they're not very competent. They're not very capable. And we probably have one of the dumbest group of elites, particularly in the West, that has ever governed things. I mean, as we discussed, you have to go back to before World War I or what led to the global depression and the banking class to find people as foolish as these people, because I don't think they anticipate this. It's like, I don't even understand what Europe's doing. Like, I get the U.S. can find ways to bounce back. We're killing the dollar, which will have all kinds of ramifications in terms of reserve currency, and there'll be some short-term serious pain. But I think in the long term, that might be a better place for America to be. But I don't see where Europe benefits from this at all, ever.
No, I don't see it at all. I mean, obviously I'm very much a European, somebody who lived in France for a while, somebody who, has connections with Germany, and somebody who obviously lives in Britain and who comes from Greece. I've never felt more pessimistic about the future of Europe than I ever have. And can I just say also, the way in which those who drive this ideological project, which is the EU, have seized on this to push that project even harder, even as they come up with fantastic projects like, we're going to end 2/3 of our dependence on Russian gas within 10 months. I mean, it's just, I just was flabbergasted when I saw that. I mean, how do you do that? I mean, nobody's explained how that can be done. And in fact, by the way, we are now importing more gas from Russia at this moment than we have ever done. I mean, we've actually increased the volumes over the last few days because we've got to refill all those reserves, all those underground reserves, which are almost empty. But anyway, that's another story. But I mean, how can we be so blind and so ideologically fixated as to destroy our own economic future? And we don't have in Europe that reserve of underlying economic strength that comes from resources and large continental economy with big population and economies of scale that you do in the United States. We are a much more, in some ways, energy intensive economies. I mean, all those little businesses which, in Italy make their handbags and all of that sort of thing. Well, the German car industry, all of those, they need reliable energy at a stable price. Where's it going to come from? Where's the food going to come from? And of course, we do that on top of all of these other policies, which have been anyway constricting our technological and industrial growth for a very, very long time. We don't want nuclear power. We're building windmills, which, to be said straightforwardly, are highly problematic. We don't have that ability that America has to bounce back. So we're going to become a backwater. And it's exactly what Robert said. People are going to come to us. They're going to see our cities. They're going to visit our museums. And, we'll become a nice place to visit. But in terms of our future, we've cut ourselves off from it.
A nice place to visit, but what about a nice place to live?
Well, we won't be that for much longer. We won't be that for much longer.
Don't worry, Klaus Schwab has a solution for you. Just
Yeah.
get used to those yummy little insects.
Yeah.
Tastes good, Ride the public bus to everywhere. You don't really need heat in your house, just wrap up in the blankets. You'll own nothing and like it. So it's extra. I mean, these people are politically clueless, by the way. They got to fire Klaus if you're the globalist. This idiot just keeps saying things out in the open, probably a little more than he's supposed to, as the propagandist for their agenda. But also he just says things that people look at and they say, I want nothing to do with that. No, I don't want to eat crickets for breakfast. That's not that's not the solution to the problem. But it might be part of the future in terms of the way things are moving at the current pace. It's almost the only resolution. There's no place for them. Green energy is a fiction. And to the degree, I mean, only France is talking about nuclear power, really. The Germans aren't, others are not. America's really kind of not. But in terms of Europe, and even if they do, of course, who makes the uranium? Who has all the enriched uranium? Hint, it's over in the East, in Kazakhstan and Russia.
Yeah.
The whole thing about Europe is that these people in Brussels, they're not accountable to anybody.
No.
And at the end of the day, that's why you're seeing what's happening in Europe happen, is because everyone that's in Brussels, they really don't care about the populations in the countries at all. And even our elected leaders don't care that much about the countries that they've been elected to lead. They care more about the cocktail parties and the dinner parties that they're going to have when they go to Brussels to hang out with all the other technocrats like von der Leyen and Jean Michel and all of these guys. So, I mean, Europe, the whole EU is completely broken. I wonder if this is going to be the beginning of the end for the European Union, and we end up going back to a nation state Europe like we had before this disastrous idea to create this union of European nations and these EU values that we hear so much about.
I think at the moment it'll go in the opposite direction. I'm very pessimistic about this. I think that the worse things become, the more the EU centre will try to intensify and exert more control. That's my own sense. And we already see how they're essentially moving towards trying to create a kind of fiscal backstop to monetary policy, all completely unaccountable, all very, very illogical. We see the attempts to create an EU force. It's only 5,000 men at the moment, but eventually that might evolve into something. But I think at the moment these people feel that this is a crisis that they can use to intensify integration and to isolate and marginalize any dissidents and critics within the Union, the European Union, by saying that they're somehow Putin sympathizers. So I think that's how it's going to go. Now, eventually it will go smash, because it always does. And these kind of utopian, unrealistic, fantastic projects always do. And can I just say, on the topic of Klaus Schwab and the WEF and all that it is, remember, it was initially very much a project for European integration, and its origins and its backing came and come from European old money. People who are not involved in manufacturing, in running businesses, in doing those sort of things. If you look at its background, that's exactly what it was. Anyway, just to say that in parentheses. But anyway, I think that they will run with this thing until it goes smash. And then, of course, after it's gone smash, we might very well start to see the old European countries resurfacing. But what kind of a world will we be in by that point? I mean, things are not going to stand still. The US is going to go forward eventually. I have no doubt about this, by the way. Russia will, in its own kind of way. China will, no doubt, in its own sort of way, which, one can look at and one can have concerns about. But at that point, we will have lost decades of time. And decades of time is the one resource you can't just throw away if you're relatively small countries like those in Europe.
I mean, speaking of China, I've been struck. I mean, you guys were predicting this before it became public, that this was going to go Putin to Xi. And I mean, what was fascinating to me was the West, and like I really fully grasped how much they see China as just their factory worker they can command around. And this explained the sort of global reset agenda combined with how they see China fit within it. They see China as just their place to play with as they see fit. Don't really respect its independence. Again, like it's frozen, like we're 1995 and West Wing is on TV and they want to play in the West Wing TV show. For those that don't know, in the international audience, watch that show. And these people grew up on that. I was working I was an intern in DC at the time. I was working at the AFL-CIO as a college kid and at the White House. I was a Sunday intern. We got to do the newspaper, all that jazz. For those people out there, I did not meet Monica Lewinsky, but had I probably would have said hi. But none of us got jobs. Only Monica got a job. So, you can read, but everybody knew right away as soon as they knew that she got a job what that story was. She was the only intern since Diane Sawyer to get a job. So but putting that aside, their mindset back then in the 90s was this unipolar world, and they borrowed heavily from the British Victorian Englishman burdens, definite justification for colonialism. I mean, it's like the Mongols at least didn't go around pretending they were sharing their values and trying to help you on, they just came in and killed everybody unless you paid the tribute, right? I mean, they're pretty straightforward about all these things. The Brits, to a large degree, almost manufactured this idea that you had to have this great moral, self-righteous, virtue signaling justification for your imperialism. And we borrowed from that heavily. I mean, you see it with Blinken when his first speech goes to the first meeting with China, and China mostly slaps him around. But sits there and lectures them about this and that and their internal politics and policies, which they were never going to respect, at least of all. As you're seeing on Chinese television right now, where they're going through, it's like, can you imagine America's lecturing people about these things? And they go through the United States as war. I mean, on, straight up saying invading our dear vice president, bigger country invades smaller country. That's always wrong. Did you skip the last 60 years of American political history? What was Grenada then? I mean, come on. I mean, just how do these people think? But I am watching how they have reacted to China. It's like and watching a lot of the internal dialogue. There are people on our locals board that were following this who really bought into this hype. Thought they were reading Central European sources when really it was regurgitated Western European sources. Like, people don't realize that the Kiev Independent is not exactly independent. It's a publication that's backed by Western money going back over a decade. That's why they're the number. They're still putting out Ghost of Kiev stories. 2 days ago, they put out a Ghost of Kiev stories. Sam Hyde is still knocking down those Ruskies. I mean, just astounding. But they really believed that China was going to fold last week. If you read a lot of their internal conversations and you read what they were, China had no choice. China was gonna fold. I mean, it's like, to give people an idea of the degree of idiocy, you have the former ambassador to Russia, who's on Twitter saying we should just take Russian oil and not pay them.
Yeah. Is this McFowle?
Yeah.
McFowle. I was like,
I saw that. I saw that. Put it in an escrow account. I mean, it was just. I saw that. I mean, I remember clutching my head and saying, what kind of idea is this? I mean, it was so bizarre, so weird. Yeah.
He was the United States ambassador to Russia. But like, these people were all saying, these think tank types, etc., that are sort of part of this world, that China was just about to fold. That, Lavrov was coming in the plane and then had to turn around, and that secretly meant the Chinese had rejected the Russians. They want to be part of the international order. They know they have to obey. They know they have to get in line. They know they have to curtsy and take a knee. That they're eager to prove to the West that Russia should be isolated, that Russia should be wiped out, that and to be on good graces. Yeah. And they really thought that Friday conversation that was going to happen. And when none of that happened, I think they were truly shocked. And so they found a pretext to whack some people on, because we always have to define, the Englishman's burden justification. We're doing this for the Uyghurs. We're doing this for Hong Kong. It's coincidence that they rejected our approach on Russia when we're going to sanction a couple of these ambassadors and diplomats and whatever. They haven't even named them yet. But we can't accelerate and escalate with China in this way. Because we need what China has more than China needs what we have. Yeah. And I don't know if, we should have learned this lesson in the pandemic. There are ways you can go at it like Trump did, but Trump was very careful It was, stage
Yeah.
1, stage 2, stage
Yeah.
3, stage 4. It was not just, hey, I'm going to make a political point about how we run you. We tell you what to do when we want. I mean, that's going to even be more offensive to China. And I think all it increases the risk of is if China starts getting seriously sanctioned, why not go in and take Taiwan?
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, all of a sudden your motivation not to do it starts to reduce. It seems like we're inviting that to occur by these set of policies.
Yeah. Can I just say, on the subject of Lavrov, he's actually heading to Beijing on the 31st of March. The Russian Foreign Ministry announced it just a few hours ago. So that trip is now, that non-existent trip that we're talking about, with his flying his plane around, it's now actually going to happen. Now, on Donald Trump and China, I follow the sort of Chinese media in a kind of a way. I mean, Global Times, Xinhua, all these places, China Daily. And the very clear impression I got, by the way, is that the Chinese actually had a kind of quiet, almost respect for him, because they understood where he was coming from. They understood exactly what he was about. They knew very well when he came along and said, I'm going to increase these tariffs because I want to build up American industry, and I think you've taken advantage of us in all sorts of ways. Well, the Chinese would say, this is terrible, this is horrible, this is absolutely wrong. But I think fundamentally, they understood what he was about. I don't think they like the Biden team at all. And I think that while they had a kind of respect for Trump and understood him, they have no respect for the current team at all, and don't even want to understand them. I think that they feel that they are fundamentally an ideological group, not really people who understand how the world works, and people who are fundamentally hostile to China as a country, as a civilization, in a way that I don't think they ever felt that Donald Trump was. And I can much more likely see a smash between China and the US now than I ever saw under Donald Trump. And I honestly think that there's going to be a crisis over Taiwan very soon. And I was deeply, deeply troubled when I read I've discussed this in programs, when I read the readouts between Biden and Xi, the conversation that happened on Friday. I mean, what happened was that Xi basically said to Biden, you're lying to me. You're saying one thing to me, you're doing the opposite of what you're saying. You're saying to me that you don't want to change our political system. You accept the one China policy. You want to move forward constructively on all of these things. That's what you say to me. But what you do is something completely different. Now, that is disastrous. I mean, be confrontational if you like, but don't be treacherous in that kind of way, because that totally destroys trust. And I never saw that happen in any of the discussions between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, or between Donald Trump's people and the Chinese. So that is a fundamental difference, which I think one really needs to understand, because where that trust goes, that's where things become very dangerous over Taiwan and over other things in a way that they never were whilst Donald Trump was president.
And if they go into Taiwan, good luck finding semiconductor chips and other things. I mean, it's these and not only that, it's like we're going to go to economic war and escalate the stakes to almost real war with two of the greatest nuclear powers in the world. One of which controls almost, which is the leading manufacturer of real goods, and the other one is one of the leading producers of key food and fuel resources. It's like, who thinks this way? I mean, it's that's I think, to me, the most terrifying part, because I think like people said, oh, the reason why Putin didn't do things while Trump was in was because Trump was a strong man. That had nothing to do with it at all. It was entirely because Putin knew that Trump had deep skepticism about NATO and globalism as a project and wasn't worried about Trump trying to do something like that. And Trump even had Zelensky right next to him when he was like, man, this guy's country is totally corrupt. I mean, he's just sitting there. Zelensky's like, doesn't know how to respond. And it's just Trump being Trump. whereas he knew Biden. I mean, I think all of this would have happened in 2017 had Hillary won.
Yeah.
I think that Russia
Yeah.
even disliked her more than they distrusted
Oh, yeah.
Biden. I think they were initially hopeful that maybe Biden wouldn't be a disaster,
Yeah.
but it's all a Hillary. It's the junior varsity team from the Obama administration that's running our foreign policy.
Yeah.
And these are people, you're right. It's because of this arrogance, this virtue signaling arrogance of these international globalist neoliberal believers. It adds insult to injury that Russia feels it's not respected. China feels it's not respected. Neither one ever believed that about Trump. China saw Trump as a major economic adversary, sees us as an economic competitor, wants to change the economic relationship between our two countries to hurt us and profit the United States. So they respected him and to some degree, but considered him an adversary. Whereas this administration, they see as dangerous and arrogant incompetence.
Yeah.
And I was stunned that this was even a debate that people were predicting Xi was going to fold and capitulate. And it's like, have you not studied any of the history of China? Do you not understand Xi? Do you not understand the current China environment? Do you not understand what they, but they convinced themselves of this. And I don't think we can escalate, but every time I say that, they do something even dumber next.
Exactly. The real difference between Trump and this administration is that Trump is, as you say, he was seeing them as adversaries, and that's fine. You can have adversaries.
Yeah, absolutely.
Biden's and Hillary Clinton's and these ideologues, they see Russia, they see China, they see Syria, they see all of these countries as enemies that need to be destroyed.
Yeah.
That's how they see them. And of course you're going to get a reaction from these countries.
Yes.
They're out of control kids who don't understand how wonderful neoliberalism is. I mean, I think often they find like, how could anyone not have the same moral worldview as me? They must just be evil or dumb. That's how these people think. They completely lack strategic empathy as a skill set. And like I said, believe it's really a moral sin to actually employ.
Yeah.
And that's where we're seeing the consequences of. I mean, I think Biden, right now, we're on pace for Biden to be the worst president in American history. And or at least administration, because that was the point G made. Russia trolls Biden occasionally. It's like Biden will say all these things, and then the very next day, his own administration will do something exactly the opposite.
Yeah,
it's like, do we not understand the importance of sticking? It's like whatever policy you believe in, you at least need to have predictability for foreign partners and foreign adversaries. You can't be someone they can never rely upon. And that's the point Russia keeps making. You can't trust the West. You can't trust the West. You can't trust the West. And that argument is being more persuasive around the world.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
I have to say, I've never seen a readout in which a world leader, Xi Jinping, tells to Biden that he's lying to his face, which is essentially what that readout said. And I don't think people understood it, but if you actually pass it properly, and you've always got to pass readouts because they're written in this very weird diplomatic language, but that was what happened. And there was even a direct quote from Xi Jinping at one point, that I hear what you say and I take it very seriously, but the moment you go away, your officials do the opposite.
Yeah. So, and then you had these support networks on social media that are, China supported at various levels that put out a quote, whether he actually said it or not, don't know, but that Xi told Biden, but they was reported as such, which gives you an idea for the gist of the conversation, that in dealing with the Ukraine-Russia issue, that Xi said, he who ties the bell around the tiger is the one that needs to untie the bell. And I was like, that was actually a very apt description of why we're in Ukraine. But it's like that reveals a degree of the fact the West went. I think Blinken's people really went in thinking China was about to capitulate and fold. The fact that we're that bad at strategically reading them means our future relations with them are not only unstable, but to certain degrees unpredictable.
Yeah. So, go ahead, Alexander.
I just wanted to say, I was reading earlier today a Chinese media thing, which is about semiconductors and about whether or not China might sell semiconductors to Russia, and it basically said that they probably would, but they referred to the administration as unhinged. I've never known them to say that about Donald Trump, for example, and that was quite a high source in China. Unhinged, mad, in other words.
So we have about let's go for like another 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And all the super chats that you guys have sent and all the questions from Rumble and Odyssey, we'll answer them tomorrow. We'll get all the questions in a dedicated video, or actually a dedicated live probably, and we'll just go through all the questions and answer them. But now that we have Robert with us, and I know we were talking about this, Alexander, in the last live that we did, where we touched upon Hunter Biden, the laptop, and the connection to Ukraine. And I remember, Alexander, you said this is a topic for which Robert would be the perfect person to ask. What do you think is going on with the Hunter Biden laptop, with the connections to Ukraine? We had news today, and I can't confirm it, but this is from the Ministry of Defense of Russia, so take it as it is. They're saying, or at least they're hinting, that Hunter Biden and Soros have some connection to these biolabs. Once again, I'm not saying it's 100% or I can't confirm it, but those are the hints that we're getting from the Ministry of Defense of Russia. What's going on here, Robert?
The latter part is true because of their investment related entities. So you had private contractors involved in the Ukrainian biolabs. Those private contractor companies have financial ties to both companies that George Soros had an economic interest in and Hunter Biden had an economic interest in. And so it's a little bit removed, but it's not like 6 degrees of separation removed. It's more like 2 degrees of separation removed. And so the degree is, and how Zelensky operates, right? With the Panama Papers revealed, you have a shell company that owns a shell company that owns a shell company, and that's where the real money is. I mean, there's a guy the Panama Papers identify as being worth 140 million. It's like Ukraine is such a rich country that his TV show got him that, or maybe the man who owned the media company that helped produce that, the TV station, might have something to do with it. Of course, he's on the lam for different reasons, but that's because those Ukrainian oligarchs never know which side to play on. But I think what's happening, kind of like what happened to that Ukrainian oligarch that backed Zelensky, that then ended up facing U.S. trouble because he refused to play ball consistently when he didn't get his bank back. One of the things that his goal was that Zelensky didn't help him with in the way he thought because the IMF interfered. Because people forget all of these people are servants on the boat. None of them get to own the boat. None of them get to, and whenever they do that, they learn otherwise. From especially when you rely upon the West, and these elites. But I think the other attribute, what I said going in to Biden's administration, was I said if the deep state apparatus feels the need to keep Biden on message for whatever set of policies they want, then you'll see sporadic leaks of criminal investigation or confirmation of information related to potential criminal investigation or criminal activity. And I don't think I think you look at Biden, he's probably in this particular instance one of the restraints on escalation. That Kamala Harris, Blinken, these people want to go, like Madeleine Albright, who just passed away, who famously said, 500,000 dead kids in Iraq, that's worth it for our sanctions policy. And people were shocked when she said that. Colin Powell, she once said, what good are soldiers unless we use them? And Powell said, soldiers aren't risk pieces on a board for you to play with. But that's who she is. And then she had deep financial ties, by the way, to Ukraine. So in various aspects, Ukraine was a wonderful grift for the corrupt Western elites, particularly your political class semi-operators types. Not your bigger actors; they make bigger money elsewhere than poor Ukraine. But for these grifters, wonderful gig. But I think they're going to whenever you see that. Now, of course, the problem they have is they can't really escalate by having Harris replace Biden, because Harris has been such a disaster, both in terms of popular opinion and her own staff hates her. I used to tell people when she was attorney general here in California, she's still the dumbest lawyer I ever went up against in court. I think she failed the bar twice or whatever it was. People cannot, they're shocked by some of her statements now. And I was like, I'm not shocked. I knew her. She is just unconscionably dumb. In ways that, she's one of these, a lot of these people are IQ smart. I don't like the term book smart because book smart can actually mean smart. IQ smart, IQ test smart, you could say, but not smart in the real world and they're a disaster. She's not IQ smart. She doesn't even get past that threshold. That's why she sits there and says the passage of time is interesting about the passage of time and the time of passage and the passage of time. You're like, what the fudge? We love Ukraine. They're our NATO ally. You were sent over there to, so this is classic. But as long as she's there, she's for Biden. And now I think maybe that's the reason why Biden picked her. Like, I thought she was a bad choice, neoliberal favorite, Wall Street favorite, military establishment favorite, but not popular, not very bright. Maybe Biden picked her because he remembers Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew was the gift for Nixon. Nobody was impeaching Nixon as long as Spiro Agnew was the alternative. Yeah. As soon as he lost Spiro Agnew, impeachment time was rolling around. Yeah. And that's precisely what took place. So I think as long as Harris is like, there were conspiracy theorists afoot about this trip. Like, if you were going to do a false flag event, what if, remember there's even movies on this where the American president goes and he's shot down overseas and all that kind of stuff. So the people that are really, doing deep, like the way I describe it to people is, imagine you're writing the script. How would you write it? What event would you stage? What would get you the outcome you want? I told people none of that is likely to occur. It's not going to be a Ron Brown special, right? Ron Brown's under criminal investigation because his mistress got caught up in some problems. Yeah. This guy's been the bag man for the Democratic Party for a decade. And so Bill Clinton comes in and says, I need you to take a special commerce trip to a war-torn region. I mean, come on, your commerce secretary. You don't see that coming? The bye-bye Ronnie, he didn't come back. Yeah. So I don't think they can effectively take out Biden as long as Harris is there. People should worry if Harris, for whatever reason, is taken out. Then, especially if, you know who some people are going to recommend to replace her, right? A certain person who just got COVID who wanted movie recommendations, and people quite wisely sent her the Benghazi movie, 13 hours right on her Twitter feed. It's like that's wonderful trolling. But I think that's what's going on in the Hunter Biden story. There's no question Hunter Biden corruption took place, the scale and scope of it. But it impacts a bunch of other people. John Kerry's kids were part of this. Mitt Romney's kids were part of this. They were all this grifter kid class of these prominent politicians who are monetizing, often on behalf of their family, but often on behalf of just themselves. And they have bad personal behaviors. I'm sure Hunter and Zelensky could have a lot of parties together. So so that kind of dynamic is present. It'd be very easy to indict him for tax evasion, very easy to indict him for various corruption related to foreign affairs that was undisclosed. Because if you talk about people who violated that, I'm not a big fan of the law, but the laws regarding foreign agents, Hunter Biden violated it all over the place. When he's talking to his dad about these things. So I see it as leverage. It's a reminder to Biden, you better play ball with whatever our message is, or maybe we start to indict your son. And maybe that leads to you, but at a minimum, Biden does have, because of his death of his other son, Beau, there's a certain deep sympathy there. So, they did this to Trump all the time. Whenever Trump was wandering off and wanting to really implement a lot of his agenda, suddenly there'd be a leak about Mueller investigation looking at Don Jr. So this is how the system operates. There's people at the 7th floor of the FBI who model their career after Hoover. I think Hoover is a wonderful guy. This is the mindset of a lot of these people. That's why they're getting caught spying on Project Veritas and all of that kind of activity. They think that way. So I think that's, and I also wonder whether that was part of what, like, people were wondering, why would you highlight a diary of actually, Biden's diary? Why would you highlight that by going after Project Veritas? Maybe because you wanted the blackmail material yourself, and you wanted to make sure Biden knew that you had it. That's what James Comey's first meeting with Trump was. He was dumb enough to actually believe that was an actual legit blackmail file, where I'm sure Trump was looking at it. And he's like, I'm paranoid about germs. I'm going to have people do that in a bed in Russia? I don't think so. But that was the pitch. Here's our blackmail file. You better play ball. That's really the subtext of that conversation. And I think that's what's going on. I think Biden doesn't want to escalate in Europe. That, he likes to go up to a point, but he doesn't want to be the guy that everything falls apart on. He's your classic senator, big talker, little doer. He doesn't actually want to get entrapped in some of these problems, but other people around him do, and are pushing and pushing and pushing in that direction. And I think they have links to these prosecutors and FBI agents who are just, doing the leverage anytime they want. If you don't play ball, this is what's going to happen. Don't play ball, this is what's going to happen. And I think that's what's happening there. But there's no doubt they'll only do anything with it if they decide to take out Biden. But I can't imagine they're going to take out Biden with Kamala being his replacement. And take out Biden by getting Biden to either play ball or Biden resign in exchange for them dropping charges against his son.
Alex, this is consistent with your fear that this is an exercise in leverage, which is actually extremely worrying if you think about it, because it suggests that we are still very much on this runaway train is still gaining momentum, and that any attempt by the driver to try and slow it down, to the extent that he can slow it down, is going to encounter enormous resistance from the rest of the team. It's very, very worrying development. Robert, what did you make of William Barr coming out and saying that Biden actually lied? I mean, would that be something? I mean, it did make me wonder when Barr said that, whether it wasn't just, preparing a possible point for a future impeachment, because we did discuss impeachment in our last program, as I remember.
Yeah, I mean, Biden is very much what I think the part of Ukraine that could become part of an impeachment is not the military intervention support or anything like that, not the existence of the war, but the corruption angle.
Yeah.
The corruption angle is an easy way to pursue those issues, and because of what's happened while he's been president as well, it's created potential impeachable offenses.
Yeah.
The question is whether they could explore that topic without implicating key people of their own. I mean, this was the genius of Bill Clinton, as described in Roger Morris's book, Partners in Power. Clinton bragged about, they can't come after me for the real issues in Arkansas because I tied myself into the whole Republican political machine in the Bush family about they can't dig deep without unearthing their own skeletons. That was the genius of Clinton. That's why poor Supreme Court wannabe Ken Starr had to talk only about Monica and couldn't talk about Whitewater, couldn't talk about a lot of other things that were taking place in Arkansas. That's old Barry Seal. Who was keeping him out of prison for a while there before they whacked him on the streets when a federal judge denied him any protection. Like, that wasn't a sign. But, it shows you the corruption of our law enforcement and justice process, that this can happen. It's gotten worse in the past 10 years. It's maybe at its most egregious level ever now. And I think that because of that, that's just going to continue to limit Biden's ability. But the fact that Barr is saying something, I kept telling people early on, try to say it gently, because I had allies I couldn't be too high profile about it.
Yeah.
I kept reminding people, William Barr comes from the old establishment. William Barr comes from the Bushes. William Barr was counsel at CIA that helped cover up CIA corruption during the Church Committee investigations. I mean, that's Barr is as establishment as you get. Barr's father is the person who put Jeffrey Epstein gave him his first gig teaching at the Dalton School. I mean, Barr's father wrote some really interesting books. Let's just put it this way. Well, let's see what Barr's father tended to fantasize about. Kind of interesting. Is it a coincidence that Epstein killed himself while Barr was Attorney General? So that's who Barr really is. Some of us kept warning Trump about him, and then Trump was enraged by how Barr betrayed. There's a lot of stories that haven't come out yet. Barr betrayed Trump on election issues far worse than anyone even knows. There was documented examples of election corruption and Dropbox uses in Michigan brought to the attention of the U.S. Attorney's Office, and Barr basically shut down the investigation deliberately. So, I mean, Barr went to great lengths. Barr covered up the fact that Hunter Biden was under investigation, and yet now he's talking about him being shocked at Joe Biden lying about it. That tells me the establishment is reminding Biden of what his risk is if he doesn't stick to the script. And unfortunately, the people who are running that script are the Peter Strzokes of the world. These are people that are not only have remove, how I describe CIA analysts, remove their conscience, remove their understanding of second order consequences, remove real world experience, and voila, you now have the mindset of a CIA or State Department person. The Strzok is worse because of how corrupt he is. I think they're just sending a message to Biden, and Barr saying it is reinforcement. But I don't think they could ever pull the trigger at digging deep into Ukrainian corruption because of who it all implicates. I mean, McCain, Lindsey Graham. Now, McCain is gone, but he has a certain hagiographic image with the Ben Sasses of the world.
Yeah.
And then Romney's people were neck deep in it. I mean, they're still neck deep in it. People dig around. I mean, there are people that were key Romney advisors that were sitting also on that Burisma board with Hunter Biden. So that threat is not one that they can ever really act upon, but I think it's intended to just jar Biden enough to remind him you better stick to the script. And with Barr has proven, anytime he says something, pay attention, because it's an establishment-oriented talking point, almost guaranteed.
Interesting.
Extremely frightening.
God. Very
Actually,
frightening, actually. I mean, it does show, it gives a very ominous perspective about the way policy is made in Washington nowadays.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Guys, what do you say we wrap it up?
I
2
think so.
hours, 10 minutes.
2 hours.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.
We will answer all the super chats, all the questions from locals, from Rumble, from Odyssey, from YouTube. We'll answer them tomorrow. What do you say, Alexander?
Absolutely.
We'll do a Q&A?
That's exactly what we'll do.
Great.
Exactly
any final thoughts, Robert, Alexander, before we sign off?
I still think this is the pivotal moment where we are at a dramatic moment. And I think, as I said, the worm of doubt, as we say in Britain, is now at work. I think in Britain there's been, as I said, a sharp change of mood, and I think that they're starting to feel that they might actually lose. I'm not sure whether in Washington people have understood that yet.
Yeah, I think what may be ironic to some Americans who watch too much Fox News is that the freedom of the American eagle may need the Russian bear to feed and live well.
Wow. Great way to put it. And where can people find you? Robert Barnes.
At vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
And don't forget the Hush Hush episodes that he has on the Locals page. They are fantastic. Highly recommended. I'm going to have the link to the Locals community in the description box down below. Actually, I do have it right now. So just click that link and go to Robert Barnes' local community, and we will sign off. Thank you to our awesome moderators as well. Thank you very, very much. We will be back tomorrow, everybody. Take care.